Thank you so much, and hello everybody. This is Debbie Fox, and I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I'm a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, along with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our webinar on increasing access to HUD Continuum of Care housing for culturally specific communities, and this webinar today on April 23rd, 2019. On today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Sheena Morris from the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Rachna Khare from Daya in Houston. We will be fielding questions in the chat box during the webinar. Please feel free to chat with us there, and we'll have time as well at the end for Q&A at the end of the PowerPoint. So the overall goal of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium is to highlight what's coming up in the field and to share the innovative work that we're hearing from different providers and state coalitions. So we're happy to share the work of the Georgia Coalition and Daya with you all today. So I'm going to just do a really quick introduction before I pass it over to Sheena and Rachna to talk about their work, but a little bit of an overview of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium. You can see the 4 TA providers that I talked about a second ago. So those are our partners in this work. But our work is also funded by a unique partnership of 4 federal agencies that include the FIPSA office with Health and Human Services, the Office of Violence Against Women with DOJ, and the Office for Victims of Crime as well with DOJ. And then we also work with the Special Needs Assistance Program within HUD at Housing and Urban Development. So a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're going to introduce the DV Consortium and talk about how DV organizations can provide culturally specific housing resources to survivors of color, or partner with culturally specific organizations, or how culturally specifics can apply and take the lead and be able to provide housing and homelessness services with HUD resources within their programs. We're going to provide an overview of the critical intersection and look at housing and gendered violence from a intersectional approach that includes gendered violence, race, and homelessness, and how communities of color and women of color, and in particular Black women and Native American women, are disproportionately represented in homelessness and evictions. And then we're going to learn about best practices when adapting and implementing HUD Continuum of Care funded programs for culturally specific communities from our speakers. And then also, most importantly, we're going to talk about how to build authentic partnerships and create those relational connections with culturally specific organizations that are authentic and long-term to really build and create long-term change within your communities. And then to do this work, it's also important to have resources to be able to respond to the housing needs in local communities. So we're going to talk about the ongoing federal resources that came out in fiscal year 18, and now again in this summer's NOFA in fiscal year 19. We're going to talk about the DV federal set-aside and opportunities you can use to expand housing options for survivors from culturally specific communities and survivors of color. So in particular, we're going to go and introduce each of the organizations that we work with. So I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and as many of you know, we're the membership organization for all the state coalitions and territories across the country, and we do policy-related work and provide TA and training to our member programs and their local programs across the country. And then in particular, we have a project that I'm a part of that's our collaborative approach to safe housing. And I work closely, and NIDV works closely with our partners in the consortium on this work to provide TA and training to improve coordination across the domestic violence and homeless service systems. And then we also have a project that is linked very closely to the needs of survivors as it pertains to confidentiality and privacy as people are accessing homeless services. And we work with our Safety Net project to ensure confidentiality is an integral part of the housing services that people receive as they're fleeing domestic and sexual violence. So I'm going to turn over to Sheena for a second, and she can talk about her work and the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Debbie, for having me on today's webinar. Again, my name is Sheena Morris. I am the Director of Policy and Community Engagement at the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I have been at the coalition for about 11 years now and served in several different capacities, one of which has been managing our long-term housing project that we've had. Like many coalitions, GCADV is a member-based organization that provides training and technical assistance to domestic violence programs and organizations throughout the state, as well as public policy advocacy, community engagement, and then a host of other special projects. So I look forward to speaking with you all further today on building relationships with culturally specific organizations in order for them to gain access to housing resources. And I'll turn it over from there to Rachna.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rachna Khare. I am the Executive Director of Daya. We are a culturally specific DV and sexual assault non-residential agency that is culturally specific for the South Asian community in Houston. We do primarily counseling and case management, but as we've been growing and growing over the last 20 years, we've realized the very real need for housing in our community for survivors, and we have been responding to that by really taking a collaborative approach.
All right, thank you so much, Sheena and Rachna, for your overviews of your organizations and the work that you do. I'm just going to do a very, very quick overview of the problem and just the foundational research around this intersection of DV and homelessness and discrimination and racism that impacts communities of color in regards to housing. So some of this might be overview for folks, but we know that housing instability is 4 times more likely for women who have experienced domestic violence. So it's a very critical intersection around this issue, and that regardless of where survivors are coming into the system, if they're coming into a homeless agency or coming in to our domestic violence organizations, that 1 in 4 women who cite domestic violence as a major contributor to their homelessness. So people going into the mainstream homeless systems are often survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and that's one of the major reasons that they're homeless and they're fleeing as a result of domestic violence. So in the field, we know from working with survivors just many, many additional barriers and challenges that survivors face when trying to flee and escape and move on and find long-term housing resources. So many times within the dynamic of domestic violence, there's poor credit and ruined rental histories and evictions, and those are caused many times by the abuser and financial abuse that is occurring within the relationship. So there's additional barriers for survivors and just even to be able to access the housing systems and being able to get access to resources and to be in the market, the private market, because they're often discriminated against based on the credit histories and past evictions. And then also women, in particular women of color, are discriminated against in the housing market. And there's additional barriers for survivors because often there's nuisance ordinance-related issues that occur when landlords evict victims for calling the police, or if there's anything related to their children, there just increased discrimination that happens. And so there's additional barriers we need to be thinking about when addressing this issue with survivors. And then there's often employment issues and just missing work and as related to the domestic violence and the sabotaging that happens within that relationship. And then we do know oftentimes in affordable housing situations or public housing situations, there's often lease-related issues and voucher-related issues related to the abuse that sometimes people or the housing organization might not be aware of, that some of the issues that are happening within that household might be related to domestic violence. And so even though we have the VAWA housing protections, which are very important in subsidized housing, it's not always recognized within that context for survivors to get those protections because people might not see the abuse that is happening. And so just a little bit more about the intersection of race and homelessness. There was a study that came out a year or so ago with Spark, and I encourage everybody to Google it and read it, but it's an organization called Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities, and it's a project of the Center for Social Innovation. So they worked with a bunch of communities to look at different data and look at HMIS data and looking at the rates of homelessness in comparison to other populations. And so they found that disproportionately communities of color are experiencing homelessness, and in particular young adults as well, and that rates of homelessness for Native Americans are also disproportionately high and higher than the general population. And so they also collected oral histories and learned about people's stories about what led to their homelessness, and one of the things that came up is people did not become homeless because of lack of financial resources, but rather as a result of fragile social networks. So, you know, if you think of social networks where people within your community have access to resources, people are helping out each other and at least financially, and are able to support each other in getting through a crisis. But in situations where the folks with the oral histories, they became homeless because their social network, there was not the kind of social capital within. Oh, my slide somehow disappeared. All right, I'm going to go through it really quick. Sorry, hold on a sec. And Spark called this phenomenon the lack of financial capital or social capital within communities to provide that support, network impoverished, so that not only is the individual family experiencing poverty, but the network itself doesn't have the capital or assets. And that's for many reasons, of obviously for people being discriminated against for long-term assets and being in the housing market and redlining and things like that. So another thread that they saw within the oral histories that came up was that there was a lot of domestic and intimate partner violence, and it was a common thread in the lives of the respondents in the oral histories across gender and age ranges. So with all this information, we know that it's very important to be looking at this intersection and providing services and organizing with and around communities of color to ensure that they have access to housing resources and stability. And so I will, without further ado, we'll turn it over to Sheena. And Sheena, you can tell more about the work that you're doing in Georgia around the state to ensure that culturally specific communities have access to resources through different partnerships and applying for HUD funding. So I'm turning it over to you. It's all yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Debbie. So as you all have just heard from all of the background information that Debbie has just shared with us about, you know, the reasons why this is such an important conversation that we're having today, it just emphasizes all the more reason of why it's important that organizations who are resourced, such as ours, are what we would call the plug for culturally specific organizations. And so what do we mean by this terminology, or what do I mean about this by this terminology of be the plug? This is a term that is sometimes used in Black and African American communities. And what that is someone who is a resource for obtaining something valuable that would otherwise be difficult to obtain. And as we all know, it can often be very difficult for culturally specific organizations or community-based organizations that are very small to access some of the resources that we are aware of and knowledgeable of and have access to. But they very much need access to those resources because they are doing very important work in their communities. So you heard Debbie talk about some of the facts, again, of why this is such an important topic. We know that communities across the country are experiencing things, as Debbie has mentioned, such as racism, gentrification, hyper-criminalization in particular communities, homophobia, xenophobia, and these things are all significantly impacting survivors of color immigrant and refugee survivors, LGBTQ survivors, survivors with disabilities, and survivors from other culturally specific communities. We know that these ism-filled experiences are leading causes or are leading to less housing options that are safe, that are affordable, and are representative of the communities that many survivors may be identifying from. In rural communities, this could be even an additional barrier as far as there being the dynamics of very limited landlords or the variety of landlords in the community. Many times in rural communities, you will find that the housing inventory is owned by a small majority of individuals. And this can also be a challenge sometimes in metropolitan areas where, from the context of limited landlords who understand domestic violence dynamics and who are willing to work with survivors. So again, just, reiterating some of the facts that Debbie has already referenced. 1 in 5 transgender people in the United States has been discriminated against when seeking housing. This information comes from the National Center for Transgender Equality. So we know that there are high disparities and experiences of homelessness exist when we talk about the broad spectrum of women of color, particularly trans women of color and Native women. In private housing markets and even still in some helping spaces, experiences of being in appropriately placed in gendered spaces that a person does not identify with, denied housing opportunities or space because of gender identity, and often outright being evicted because of gender identity still remain to be co-occurring trauma experiences faced by transgender survivors. You'll see here on this slide that although black people comprise 13% of the general population in the United States and 26% of those living in poverty, they account for more than 40% of the homelessness population, suggesting that poverty rates alone do not explain the overrepresentation. And this information was also taken from the SPARK report that Debbie mentioned earlier. And these types of statistics, these are similar disparities that we are seeing here in Georgia or that we have seen as it relates to the rate at which black women are being killed by intimate partners. So you can definitely see that there are some intersections here. We know that domestic violence is a primary cause of homelessness in this work that we do for survivors abroad, and therefore we can't ignore how all of these things are interconnected again. This is why it's so important, again, that we are having this conversation on how to work collaboratively in order to access housing funding resources for culturally specific communities. So as I shift a bit from looking at some of the facts, the culturally specific facts that we just went over, I want to focus on the richness and importance of culturally specific community-based organizations. There we go. So we often know that culturally specific organizations are often the ones that are the bridge of connection and communication. They are often the ones that are standing as a safety net in the gaps. They're acting as those connection bridges in their communities and working with survivors to address many of the barriers and challenges that I've mentioned before, whether that be through directly advocating for a survivor or doing their part as a community-based organization to build intentional relationships with organizations such as ours and or private entities around housing. We also know that community members are often the most left out of conversations centered around solutions to violence occurring in their communities, but they are often the most informed about what is needed in their communities, and they are also very often in touch with the organizations that are specifically trying to address and meet the needs in their communities. In Georgia, we found that many survivors of color are accessing these networks instead of traditional mainstream domestic violence programming. We've held a series of community conversations where we've learned that survivors are inclined to reach out to organizations who they feel they can more culturally connect to, who understand their community dynamics, and who can help them get the resources that they need in spite of those community dynamics. So I think about an organization such as McCosh Healing Network here in Georgia, which is an organization that works specifically in the Black and African American community, working with survivors from that community. I think about how that organization is a one-person, formally led organization, very reliant on volunteers, but very in the community, and the community is aware of who the organization is, and how that organization was able to effectively advocate in helping a survivor obtain housing in less than 30 days. The organization has worked very hard to build relationships with community members, and because of this, a particular community member actually directed this survivor that was helped in less than 30 days over to the organization. I also think about an organization here in Georgia, Amani Women's Center, and that organization specifically works in the African immigrant and refugee community. This is a very close knit community, very small community, very tight-knit, and they often have unique dynamics sometimes within the community. But again, Amani Women's Center is another one of those very small grassroots, culturally specific organizations that had developed relationships with mainstream domestic violence programs and has worked with those organizations to secure housing for African immigrant and refugee survivors. And in turn, what has happened in that relationship is that you will find that domestic violence programs, when they may also have a survivor who identifies as African, that they will also send or work with Amani Women's Center for that survivor to access Amani's Sewing Academy, which then supports the survivor's ability to build economic sustainability. So these are just two examples of how community-based organizations are those bridges in various different communities. And it demonstrates the power that lies within culturally specific community-based organizations. Let's see here. So how can coalitions support culturally specific community-based organization access, capacity, and sustainability in providing housing resources for survivors? Well, as we discussed a good bit, it starts by building community relationships with you all and not just transactions. You heard me mention in the two examples how both organizations had both community relationships that they'd established as well as organizational relationships that they'd established to meet the needs of survivors in the communities that they are working with. In Georgia, the Georgia Coalition has been very intentional about listening to community-based organizations, about learning from them, about being a resource to them, and sharing access to various platforms and information on resources that we are made aware of on our end. We also need to value and understand the importance of centering the needs of community-based organizations that are serving culturally specific communities. Building these types of relationships provides new and broader insights to coalitions on the work that culturally specific community-based organizations do, and vice versa. The work that coalitions do in their states and vice versa. So through our Community Rise project, we have worked with a number of small community-based organizations to increase their overall capacity and sustainability in the work that they are doing in their communities. It has been our experience that oftentimes community-based organizations are unaware of a resource such as a coalition, or they lack the understanding of what that type of entity does. We've heard everything from, people have been intimidated or fearful of working with kind of what is considered, again, to be a mainstream organization. Or there have been times that, in our experience, where there have been relationships that have been strained with communities. Just historically, they've been strained with these types of larger organizations. Another thing is in not being, in building true relationships and not being transactional, it's often very common that culturally specific community-based organizations are left out of systems conversations, which are centered around solutions to the violence occurring in their communities. As you heard me mention earlier, this is unfortunate because these organizations are typically the most informed on who is in need of resources, the types of resources and solutions that are needed, and the most appropriate culturally responsive strategy that is needed. So, when we talk about increasing connections and collaborations between mainstream programs and community-based organizations to fill service gaps, here in Georgia on the various platforms that we have or settings that we are in, whether it be amongst our local domestic violence member programs, at one of our membership meetings or in a national setting with other states, we've been very intentional about talking about the gaps that these organizations fill in their communities and the work that they are doing. And we are also very intentional about connecting the local domestic violence program that is seen to be more of the mainstream, the funded organization, well-funded, and the homelessness programs directly to the community-based leaders in their communities. And this essentially has helped survivors working with community-based organizations gain access to housing resources and other assistance that they may not have otherwise gotten had the introduction not been made. So again, this is why it is so important that as a mainstream organization, we are working to build these connections with culturally specific organizations. Again, continuing with building community relationships and not transactions. So in order to build these community relationships, we have to be very open to exploring what the possibilities can be. It's important that coalitions seek out culturally specific community-based organizations and not have an expectation of necessarily them seeking us out. That is something that we have had to shift in our approach here in Georgia, being very intentional about going out and going to various different events or things that organizations may be hosting, and then vice versa, community-based organizations being open to the potential opportunities where relationships can be built as well. Again, as I mentioned, I understand that there are times where this can be impacted or difficult because there may be a fragile history, but there are many opportunities where organizations can reassess the work with each other and what each other is doing in their respective communities to determine if rebuilding can occur. As a coalition here in Georgia, we strive to build ongoing connections and understanding of the important work that these organizations are doing. And so I would encourage those of you on the call today who are interested in this topic to think of ways in which you can be a resource to these organizations, to be aware of being transactional only and reaching out to or working with these leaders when it may only benefit your organization. And that takes a lot of practice to recognize and do that. Remain, again, mindful that the approaches of these organizations may be very different and unfamiliar to what we or you are accustomed to, but challenge yourself to move past fear, any doubt, any uncertainty, to learn about these organizations, because so often they are doing, what really resonates with survivors from that community and from, culturally specific communities at large. So again, be open to exploring the possibilities. And then also reciprocate the knowledge and understanding to build culturally responsive housing resources and approaches. As community-based organizations are being a resource to survivors and filling gaps in their communities, it is important for them to have expansive knowledge of the equitable access to information and resources that can support permanent housing for survivors. So as you heard me mention earlier, it's very often that they are left out of resource conversations and have less knowledge about the types of things that survivors can have access to as far as it relates to housing. Here in Georgia, because we've been open to building authentic relationships and exploring the possibilities with community-based organizations, we have been able to, or are able to, strengthen their awareness of available resources, who has them, and how these resources can support the survivors they work with, as well as how various funding streams may work for survivors that they are assisting. So all of these things together can assist and aid in building those community relationships and, again, not being transactional. So finally, how can coalitions be the plug? All of this information that I've shared and these things that I've talked about today, how can coalitions be what we call the plug, the resource to culturally specific organizations? Well, one way is to identify if there are direct funding opportunities. If you're a coalition or your organization, are there direct funding opportunities and possibilities? For example, can your organization act as a fiscal agent or provide the organization's access to grant funds as subrecipients? So again, as I mentioned earlier, at GCADV, we've had a housing project for about 12 or 13 years now. It formerly was transitional housing, and now we have, transitioned on into doing rapid rehousing now. And so how that has looked is that we have been what is described as a pass-through agency, where we are the direct recipient of housing grant funds, but then subgrant those funding resources out to other selected programs throughout our state. So essentially, this means that we at GCADV are responsible for submitting the application materials and the administrative functions, such as budgeting and any reporting, while our subgrantee partners are responsible for the direct action of working with survivors and providing funded housing assistance to them. So this approach can be effective as coalitions can be technical assistance resources to programs, as hurdles may arise. They're kind of, that ear for the program to, to share any challenges with, and for, we assist our subrecipients through those challenges as they arise. And then coalition involvement in this way is also helpful, as it provides subrecipients with a perspective, or it provides the coalition with a perspective of what's happening on the ground, and gives us the leverage to utilize the experiences of organizations as an advocacy tool in broader systems advocacy. So as we're hearing things come up that may not necessarily play out in implementation, when there are certain rules or protocols that have to be followed or are recommended, as we're seeing those things play out through our programming, it gives us the ability to provide that feedback to that broader system of how that is actually playing out on the ground. We've also worked with culturally specific organizations to couple funding opportunities, to couple funding where we've connected our housing work with our economic justice partnership work. So this was an opportunity to maximize project resources by combining them. So, we've coupled our housing work with our economic justice partnership work in order to provide housing and job training support to survivors. The good thing, again, about coalitions is that we often have a broad reach and an in-depth knowledge of the detailed nuances, which can sometimes dictate the usage of funding streams, such as housing funding. We are very, well connected nationally, which affords us the opportunity to hear and share different approaches that may be occurring in other parts of the community. So in the specific example I just talked about with our housing and economic justice resources coming together, we had a economic justice grant through the Allstate Foundation, through Purple Purse Foundation, and we utilized those funds along with our housing subrecipients in order to support the employment and economic needs of survivors in those programs. And last, another way that coalitions can support culturally specific organizations' access to housing funds is simply by including those organizations in systems opportunities where knowledge of culturally specific organizations can be heard. Again, I cannot emphasize enough how often it is that these organizations' voices are not at the table, whether that be they're typically not invited to the table very often, and their voices are missing. So an example of how this could be done, and something that we have done here, is simply by inviting that organization to attend a local Continuum of Care membership meeting with you, or passing along opportunities that come along where feedback is being sought from your state housing funds administrator. Here recently in Georgia, our housing administrator released their consolidated plan, and we're seeking feedback on that plan. So one of the things that we did is we contacted all of the culturally specific community-based organizations that we are working with either through our Community Rise project or that we do have a relationship with, and we encourage them to provide feedback, to review that document, to provide feedback on, any of the programming that would impact their communities. And so we just have to be mindful and conscious that if we are committed to practicing new margin to center habits which broaden our knowledge and build authentic relationships, we will have a richer understanding of what the housing needs are and how we can help meet them in a way that is culturally responsive. This will then begin to create a system shift from mainstream cultural behaviors of providing resources and services from only one framework or one box to one that can truly extend equitable access for all survivors. So again, I just want to encourage all of you to essentially be the plug. And I'm sorry, there's my contact information. If there are any questions, let me see. Let's see. Okay. And so with that, I will turn it over to Rachna.
Thank you so much. And yes, I will encourage you all to use the chat box if you have any questions about what either of us are talking about. My name is Rachna Khare. Again, I'm the Executive Director of Daya. We are a community-based, culturally specific organization that serves South Asian survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And as you just heard, the importance of relationships and collaborations cannot be underestimated. I will be providing really a nice case study of how this kind of collaboration worked really well for our organization and for the clients that we serve. A little bit of history on Daya is we were an organization that started as a grassroots organization 23 years ago in response to a murder-suicide within the South Asian community. Now, the Greater Houston area has no shortage of domestic violence and sexual violence agencies that are available to help folks that are experiencing violence and abuse. But what came of this case, it was a 28-year-old woman who was experiencing a lot of physical abuse, lots of threats of deportation because her immigration status was tied to her husband. And in response, she ended up killing herself and her 2 children. And it was quite horrific, and she took the life of her abuser as well. And in response, 7 Indian American friends came together and said, okay, clearly people in our community are needing something else, and they're not seeking mainstream services. And that's how Daya came to be. A little bit of who we are. So the South Asian population includes India, Pakistan, the Maldives, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Across South Asia, there are over 500 languages spoken. Every major religion is practiced, as well as smaller religions as well, but the major religions are Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Christianity. The South Asian population is growing quite quickly in the United States. Between 2000 and 2010, the U.S. saw a 69% increase in the South Asian population. So we are seeing that this is a growing population and one that is definitely in need of culturally specific services. Just like every community, we see that domestic violence impacts the South Asian community at the same rates, and across all religions, across all genders, and across all income levels as well. So a little bit of our services, and this kind of ties into how and why our housing program has to be pretty innovative and well thought out. Most of our services are incredibly long-term. The average client stays with our organization for 3.2 years. So it is quite long-term and holistic case management. Of course, there is quite a bit of crisis intervention within those first few calls. We find that because there is such a stigma against domestic violence in the South Asian community, that most people call us as a last resort. And in response, there is quite a bit of crisis work that needs to be done. We also do long-term mental health treatment. There are no limitations on how long counseling can go, and counseling is conducted in the client's home language. So whether that's Hindi or Urdu or Punjabi, we have a staff that can speak multiple South Asian languages. We also use trauma-informed innovative approaches. We do EMDR at our agency, as well as CBT. So along with all the other mainstream agencies that we partner with, we also do the professional work of safety planning, helping with protective orders, police reports, and public benefits. We do it all with a cultural lens, though. So, for example, with our protective order process, we have a partnership with the Harris County DA's office as part of their cultural outreach program, to where clients of ours do not need to go to the downtown DA's office to apply for a protective order. Rather, that work is done within our office. This really helps break down some of the barriers that South Asian survivors face, especially as it relates to language, transportation, and immigration status. We also do legal consultations and representations through our legal clinic. This is both for family law and immigration law. Most of our clients need both. And then we have financial assistance for housing, for legal services, for transportation, childcare, and education. We follow a model of flexible funding. We like to meet the client exactly where they are, realize what needs do they need met, and try to get those needs met so that they can be on their way to safety and independence. And then most importantly, the support is provided in multiple South Asian languages, and it is provided with a culturally specific lens. So clients don't have to explain cultural nuances. This is something our staff understands. Most of us are South Asian on the staff and or similar immigrant backgrounds. So some of the unique challenges that South Asian survivors and similar immigrant survivors, so when I say that, we primarily serve South Asian clients, but about 20% of our clients were non-South Asian. Of that, most of them are Middle Eastern or North African or East Asian. And you'll see that this is because some of the cultural barriers that South Asians face are also faced by these similar immigrant groups. So language barriers is one that's pretty obvious. I imagine that you all can see how a language barrier would make it difficult for South Asian survivors or immigrant survivors to reach out to mainstream agencies. Being able to tell your story in your own language and receive support in your own language is an incredibly powerful thing. There are also many financial barriers. So many of our clients who come to the U.S. With their spouses, they may be working in their home country, but, and I'll get into immigration abuse in a little bit, but they perhaps don't have work history here in the United States. They may not have the proper visa status to work in the United States because they might be on an H-4 spousal visa. For this reason, many of them are not able to build their own income here when they come to the U.S. Alongside with that, even immigrants who have been here for many, many years, their spouses keep them from controlling the finances, and this is a very closely held cultural belief, and it is very difficult for many of our survivors to access even the own income that they bring into the household. There is quite a bit of isolation that is emotional isolation as well as physical. Many of the clients that we see are from arranged marriages, and most of their families live not only not in the city of Houston or the state of Texas, but sometimes not even in the United States. So the isolation can become quite extreme if the abuser controls their ability to call home, to use Skype. They may only be able to contact friends and loved ones when they're in the presence of their abuser because of strict internet passwords that aren't shared with them or very closely monitored cell phones. Along with that, on the flip side, there's a lot of in-law abuse. So in some cases, the extended family is not even a source of support. Most of our clients suffer some sort of in-law abuse, both from parents-in-laws and brothers and sisters-in-laws. And there are multiple perpetrators. This can be emotional and verbal, but it is quite often physical and in many cases sexual as well. And in that case, it is also quite common for survivors to be living in homes that include extended family. So it may be the case that mom and dad and child are living, but with the dad's parents as well, or perhaps even in a larger extended family home with brothers and sisters of the abuser. Some other unique challenges is lack of trust in systems or groups outside of immediate family. So this includes law enforcement, the legal system. Many of these survivors are coming from countries where these are not trusted resources. It is absolutely not lost on me, though, that this lack of trust in these systems is not just across immigrant communities, but across many communities of color here in the United States. There's also sometimes a false hope. A lot of times we have survivors come and say, oh, but we thought in America the legal system is completely fair, and how is it that if he abuses me, how can he still get custody over our children? And so there's a lot of education to be done, a lot of expectation management, and quite a bit of lack of trust in systems that are not familiar to these survivors. Another unique challenge is transnational abandonment. We see, and this is very closely tied to the need for housing in South Asian communities, transnational abandonment is when the abuser will often abandon the victim either in the home country or in the U.S. And this is most naturally done by taking a trip, right? So it can look like they go to a wedding, and the wedding might be in Bangladesh, and then they go to the wedding, and then the abuser may say, okay, I have to come home for work, but you stay here for just 2 more weeks, finish out your vacation. But then with him, he takes her passport, her visa, and by the time she can come over here, he's already filed for divorce and for custody, and it looks as though she's abandoned him and the child because it's taken so long for her to get back to the country. This can also happen the opposite way, where the husband will go for a trip to, say, Pakistan or India, and then not come back, and perhaps the lease is in his name, and now the victim is left with her child and with an apartment or a home that she can no longer afford. We see quite a bit of immigration abuse as well. 75% of undocumented victims of domestic violence stated that they were undocumented because their spouse did not file the proper paperwork. So we see that quite a bit. It allows for a great deal of control. If the survivor does not have proper immigration status, even if she wants to call the police or call for help from a shelter, the abuser will often tell her to go ahead and do that. They're going to deport you. So there's quite a bit of taunting and threats of deportation. With the changing political climate, too, those threats get realer and realer every single day. And so it's a big fear that survivors have to face. Also, if they are undocumented but their child was born here, if they are deported, the U.S.-born child would stay in the U.S. with their abuser. And so they're often making a very difficult decision between their own safety but also access to their child. And because of all of these reasons and because of cultural taboos and cultural stigmas, the most prevalent thing we see is minimizing and underreporting of abuse. And this impacts the South Asian survivors specifically when they're part of mainstream housing systems, because they do not report. For example, sexual abuse is very, very underreported in our community. Sex itself is a very taboo topic, and to talk about sexual assault by your spouse is extremely taboo. And so it would not be something that would come out immediately in a danger assessment or any kind of housing assessment that might be done by a mainstream DV agency. So for that reason, we find our clients oftentimes in need of housing and unable to access mainstream housing services. Most of this is tied to the fact that they are frequently not accessing mainstream systems in general. So in response to that, we started at Daya our supportive housing program in 2014. We did have a transitional home in the early 2000s, which was then sold for this rental assistance program in an effort to help more clients live in the areas of the city that they were comfortable living in. We also did a capital campaign through community donations to build a strong fund for supportive housing for our clients. This is an incredibly flexible fund. We find, as we've started to get into rapid rehousing, and I'll talk about that shortly, many of our clients may not score as high on some of the assessments that are used to prioritize housing. And so this fund is incredibly flexible. We are able to provide really unrestricted housing assistance to survivors of domestic violence that may otherwise fall through the cracks of mainstream systems. It is 100% donor supported, which is very helpful for us. But at the same time, the challenge is that it remains short-term because it is not as sustainable as a HUD grant would be or as rapid rehousing has been for us. In general, most of the clients accessing this housing program receive rental assistance for 3 to 9 months, which, as you can all imagine, is definitely not enough when somebody is fleeing domestic violence. So we started to see this as a major challenge, and instead of it being a long-term solution, it really was becoming just a Band-Aid to get people to the next day. And while that's important, while every single day and every single step is important, we knew we needed to do something that was more sustainable for our clients. Up until then, we had not had any sort of formal housing program. We had not had any grants with HUD. We had not had any federal housing grants. This was primarily because of the fear of the administrative process of it all. It was a very small, we're a small organization. There's 9 staff in total. You know, we had never done this before. And so it was, what we didn't want to do is get a HUD grant and then mess up, you know, some administrative component, thus hurting our ability to get this kind of funding in the future. And that's where our partnership with our coalition with the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council started. We had been working with HCDVCC in a partnership way for many years. The way that started is that they reached out to us, similar to what Sheena was saying. They reached out to us and said, you know, why don't you come to a membership meeting? So we started just going to their meetings, learning about their work, getting more connected to mainstream agencies, getting more connected and learning more about mainstream funding opportunities. And then in 2016, the executive director of the Domestic Violence Coordinating Council reached out to me and said that they were about to start a HUD rapid rehousing grant, and they were reaching out to 5 organizations that are serving underserved populations to offer them a subcontract. Again, you heard this in the last presentation, but this was really and truly a life-changing moment for our organization. There is no way we could have taken on the administrative load of applying for these funds and HUD audits and understanding what case files need to look like and policies and procedures, and the Coordinating Council helped us develop all of these. So the way this program works since 2016, and it's still ongoing, is that we are a subcontract through the Houston Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. We're able to provide clients with 12 or more months of rental assistance. This has been incredibly important for our clients. As I mentioned, our previous housing support ranged from 3 to 9 months. So the idea that we could now give some of our clients that are dealing with an incredible amount of trauma and going through extremely long immigration processes, so their immigration status may not be verified for another 20 months, and so being able to get stable employment becomes very difficult in that time. This 12-plus months has been really life-saving for our clients and the survivors that we work with. Some of the challenges, though, is that, of course, this was a more stringent program. We could not just very easily and flexibly give out rental assistance the way we do with our supportive housing program. It was also based on a common assessment. In Houston, we use an assessment called the EPA, and it goes through, it uses some of Jacqueline Campbell's danger assessment, but it also has added questions about housing and homelessness, and it is a common assessment that's given to everybody. We found that our clients were scoring very low on this assessment. I'll talk about some of those reasons. And for that reason, if they were looking for rapid rehousing through a mainstream agency, they wouldn't have been able to get it. But because one of the questions that we added on the assessment is, are you looking for culturally specific services, this really helped our survivors have their scores bumped up. Some of the things that were missing on that common assessment, well, the main thing that we found is that it did not consider in-law abuse and it did not consider immigration abuse. The in-law abuse is extremely important for our clients. It causes compounded trauma not only for the survivor but for their children as well. They are watched in a very, very close way. Even if their abuser is able to go off to work, oftentimes they are living with their mother-in-law, who is physically and emotionally abusive as well, and father-in-laws and brother-in-laws as well. And so this incredible amount of family abuse was not factored into the traditional or to the common assessment that was provided at the beginning of our program. However, we were thrilled to get this assistance, and we were able to provide many families with at least 12 months of rental assistance due to this program, and due to the fact that the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council reached out to us and provided us with so much support. So what we've done now, this rapid rehousing for us started in 2016 and we're now in 2019. We do a nice combination of rapid rehousing plus supportive housing. So we combine our two housing programs to serve more clients. We're able to then maximize housing assistance to account for the needs for longer services. As I mentioned, most of our clients are with us for many, many years, and most of that is due to the fact that they are facing so many barriers due to cultural stigma, due to the fact that their families may not be supportive of them getting divorces, and they may often even be disowned by family and by community when they do choose to leave the relationship. Aside from that, the immigration process gets very, very complex. It can take many, many years for a VAWA or for a U visa or a T visa, and due to that, they need extra support. The work authorization may come sooner than the visa. However, it is much harder to get stable employment without legal status. So this combination of rapid rehousing plus our supportive housing has been really, really phenomenal. We're able to help clients who are either fleeing or leaving shelter by first putting them into our rapid rehousing program for as long as we can, and then following up by supplementing that with the 3 to 9 months from our supportive housing program. At the same time, because of our rapid rehousing grant, we're able to focus our community donations more on our supportive housing program. Our community is thrilled to see that we have the rapid rehousing program and that we have federal dollars coming in to provide housing support. It improves our legitimacy within our community, and it gives people the confidence in investing in this program. We also did something called the Daya Survivor Startup Support. What that includes, what we were finding is that with rapid rehousing, people would get people would get an apartment, but they would have no furniture, and they're fleeing a home. And so we have really worked out an incredible way of getting them the same bed. So we order the same bed from Walmart. We have standardized all of this. We do a couch, a bed, a coffee table, and then we have donors give to our Survivor Startup Kit plates and bowls and kitchen supplies and bathroom supplies as well. I'm seeing a question of an example of how we combine the two housing programs. Yes, I can give you an example of that. What we did for one client, and she was undocumented when she started the program. She was able to go directly into rapid rehousing because she was actively fleeing, and that was one of the stipulations, that you have to be actively fleeing. And as her 12 months came to an end, so I would say around month 7 or 8 is when we started to talk to her about what comes next. We met with her immigration attorney, and her divorce attorney, and really thought of what that timeline was going to look like. And from there, what we were able to do is go to our board of directors, and they're the ones that approve our supportive housing assistance. And we were able to say, okay, we've assisted this client with what we're at month 8 of 12. And as we're preparing, we're speaking to our attorneys, and they're saying, her VAWA is going to take X amount more months. So I think it was like 7 or 8 more months. And so we were able to request that assistance through the supportive housing program. So by month 8 of her 12, she was guaranteed not only 12 months, but an additional 8 months after that. That really, really helped. That really helped her be able to focus on her legal case and her immigration case. It gave her a lot of peace of mind. She also has an 8-year-old son who's autistic. It was very important for us to keep her in the school district that he was in, because he was really flourishing at the school that he was in, and we were able to do that. The furniture, I have another question that says, the furniture that you provide, do you get funding from private donors? Yeah, we do. We actually get funding. What we ask, we used to have many donors, and I'm sure you all do, who say, oh, I have this coffee table, I have this dresser, I have this chair that I don't need anymore. What we are finding is, as a non-residential agency, we just didn't have the capacity to store this stuff, and we also didn't have the ability to do all the quality assurance and the logistics that were needed to pick up a bunch of furniture and move it to different places, it became really, really difficult and unmanageable. So what we did is we tailored our list down of what in-kind donations we would take, and it really is limited to like bedding, plates and bowls, shower curtains, stuff that we can put in our little supply closet. And what we do for furniture is we work through another organization called the Houston Furniture Bank. What they allow is for nonprofits to get low-cost vouchers, and then the advocate will go with the client to go pick out some of the furniture pieces. Now, because most of our clients don't have access to transportation, we generally send our advocates or even now our volunteers with the vouchers, but we know exactly what we'll provide. So we've kept it a very standardized system. Every client knows that they'll get a bed for themselves and each of their children. They know they'll get one couch, a dining table with 4 chairs, and a coffee table. And so even clients who say, oh, but I really need a dresser, I would love a desk, it isn't something that we do, and it's also, that's for 2 reasons. One is because we want to be able to provide more people with what they need. The other thing that we are finding is that when we had donors who wanted to, really donate every piece of furniture from their house or from their garage, when the client would have to move, it was re-traumatizing to then figure out what to do with all that furniture. So, of course, as you all know, we have clients that may be part of these housing programs but may then have to re-enter shelter. And giving up some of those big furniture pieces that felt very luxurious and very extravagant became re-traumatizing and very difficult for our clients. So we've really tried to keep it a little more streamlined. And yes, we do have a donation wish list on our website. Our website is dayahouston.org, and we call it the Survivor Startup Kit, and it lists all of the things that we take, and it also lists the things that we don't take. And it describes the fact that you can also donate monetarily to be able to provide some of the bigger furniture pieces. And then, Sheena, do you want to add what you all partner with your furniture bank on?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was just saying in the chat that many of the programs that are subrecipient partners with us on our housing project work with their local furniture bank as well. But again, going back to that relationship building with community-based organizations, one of the community-based organizations that GCADV provides technical assistance to actually focuses on solely providing furnishings as well as doing some hotel-motel voucher type of things for survivors. And so we've been able to connect survivors in our housing programs or in other DV organizations' housing programs to that organization in order to secure furnishings.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. I will say that I cannot stress enough how important the support from the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council has been. The access to this HUD funding, again, I know I've said it was life-changing for us and life-saving for our survivors. That's even an understatement. We have been able to, starting off when, in 2016, before this grant started, we were able to we provided, I think it was 74 months of rental assistance in 2016 through our supportive housing program, and that was because most survivors got about 3 to 6 or 9 months of rental assistance. Closing out 2018, we provided 174 months of rental assistance. That was a combination of just the rapid rehousing months, but also the fact that this program has energized our community to give more to our supportive housing program. Aside from that, it's allowed us as an organization to take more chances in funding that we apply for. It's given us more confidence in reaching out to different housing programs as well. We've gotten housing assistance from other grants now, foundation grants, and we've been able to do that because now we're able to say, yes, this is a very critical service that we provide in an expert way. So we know that because we're following the best practices that we've learned from our coordinating council, we know now that builds our legitimacy not only in our community but with other foundations as well. They have helped incredibly on the administrative and reporting support. We do our, we provide we do the administrative piece of it. Like we do the rental assistance, we do, the applications, all of that. But anytime we have a question, anytime we need any kind of technical assistance, they are there in a heartbeat. We really could not have done that without the support that they've given us. We've also successfully passed our HUD audit, and that was because of all of the preparation and the support that we got from our coalition. We're also given housing navigation support. We did not really know where to start in some ways because we had not worked with housing rental assistance in this fashion before. So we were given a great list and connections to apartments that accept rapid rehousing. We were given one-on-one introductions to these folks who now we have exceptional partnerships with in and of ourselves. And so not only do they accept our rapid rehousing, but they'll now accept our short-term supportive housing rental assistance too. And then it's also, given us, of course, the idea of learning best practices and following a housing-first model. Previously, in 2014, when our supportive housing program first started, we had, eligibility for our supportive housing program, and some of the things in it were not housing first. I'll be the first to admit that we weren't doing this according to our field's best practices. So we would say, oh, the person must be getting counseling, for example, to receive rental assistance, or they can't be have any history of drug or alcohol use. Those are things that have now, those are eligibility requirements that have now been removed because we've learned that that isn't a survivor-centered way of doing this work. And in response, we've been able to help a lot more people receive help post their traumatic experiences. Let's see. I would like to say, though, as much of support that we've gotten from the Coordinating Council and from our coalition, we believe that we've been able to support them and strengthen them as well. Our goal at Daya is to build a more culturally competent social services network overall across all mainstream DV agencies too, and I think we've made an incredible difference by being at the table. We've been able to provide that cultural lens at all of these really important meetings where big decisions are made. For example, I talked about that common assessment, the assessment that we use for coordinated access to rapid rehousing. And because of our involvement, they have modified this assessment, not just for our agency, but for every single agency that's using it. For everyone in our coalition is using a modified assessment that includes in-law abuse. It includes immigration abuse. It includes whether somebody is receiving support and or pressure from family members. And so we have created, with us having a seat at that table, we've been able to create a more culturally competent tool that everybody is using. Because obviously not every South Asian survivor and not every immigrant survivor is going to come to our agency. We know that. So the more that we can help create this cultural competency across the whole system, the better we're going to do for all survivors. This has also helped for advocacy across all immigrant groups. We are culturally specific for the South Asian community. As I mentioned, we have many Middle Eastern clients, we have many North African clients, and some East Asian clients, but this has helped with all immigrant groups. We have found that even in some of the areas of Houston that see a very high Hispanic population, they have said that this modified assessment has helped some of their victims score higher as well, because in-law abuse and especially the societal taboos and the immigration abuse is extremely prevalent across all immigrant groups. Immigration status is an incredibly powerful tool of control. Let's see, because of this, we're ensuring that survivors do not fall through the cracks. In Houston, there is the wait list, and we never call it a wait list, but the list to get housing assistance is incredibly long. And we were finding that many immigrant survivors were falling through the cracks because their vulnerabilities were not accurately represented. And so even with the modification of that common assessment tool, the fact that they can still select, yes, I'm looking for culturally specific services and language-specific services, that helps ensure that the most vulnerable in our society are not continuing to fall through the cracks of these major housing systems. And then it's better collaboration across all the agencies. We have learned so much from our partners, and they have equally learned so much from us. And we're able to do warmer and better referrals to each other, and we're able to support more people and not duplicate efforts as much as we were previous to taking a big role on the Housing Steering Committee of our coalition. I see a question about the modified assessment tool. I do have it. It's not on our website, but I think, Debbie, if I email it to you, can you send it out? We're happy to share it. If I email it to you, would you be able to share it with the group?
Yeah, I'll do a follow-up email, and I'll send out the materials as well.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. Yeah, we're happy to share that. That's something that took, over a year of work, and the work was done by the advocates. It was done by the people that are actually working with survivors doing these housing assessments. So it's a really wonderful process to see. And then just to close out, I wanted to give a case study of one of our clients. She was happy for me to share her story and her name. Her name is Tanzina. She has 4 kids. So Tanzina had an arranged marriage in Bangladesh. She met her husband the night of her wedding, and which is not uncommon, but obviously not always the case. But in her case, she met her husband the night of their wedding. The abuse started right away on their wedding night. He would use, there's a lot of reproductive coercion. He would not use protection, which resulted in 4 children, and which he would blame her for. He then fled the country and left her because there was a police case against him. And she, even now, this was years ago, and even now she's unable to find him to serve him with divorce because he's likely not in the country. She lived at multiple different shelters, both DV shelters and homeless shelters, and experienced many, many barriers, especially at the homeless shelters. She is a Muslim who does not eat pork. She also eats halal meat, so it has to be prepared in a culturally specific way. And at the homeless shelters, they would not allow her to bring in food for her children. And she described, she was a speaker at our recent event just 2 weeks ago, and she described having to sit on the curb of a gas station in the cold and eat the sort of food on the curb, and people would ask them if they needed money or help, and how traumatic that was for her children. She was able to get rapid rehousing because we were brought on as a site. She typically wasn't scoring as high on the assessment because so much of her abuse was committed not only by her abuser but by his brothers. She experienced a great deal of sexual abuse from his siblings as well, and she experienced a great deal of emotional abuse from her mother-in-law. Her family also did not want her to leave her husband. In fact, they said, if you do leave your husband, you have to give him all 4 of your children, which she, of course, was not willing to do. So she was able to get onto rapid rehousing because she did need culturally specific services. As she is from Bangladesh, she was experiencing immigration abuse. So just a little bit of what she said, and this is, her words, not at all edited. She said, getting rental assistance has been one of the most important parts of my life. It was a turning point. When I first held my keys, I cried tears of joy. It was life-saving. The kids were so excited to be able to say they finally had their own place. To this day, my youngest son, who is 8 years old, has the exact date and time memorized for when we first moved into our apartment. If Daya had not helped me and my family with housing, I have no idea how my life would have turned out. She gave a wonderful speech about housing assistance to our community just 2 weeks ago at an event we had, and we were so thrilled to have the executive director and deputy director from the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council there as well, so that they could see what an impact it's made that they, back in 2016, so thoughtfully reached out to us and asked us to be a subcontract on this program. It has been quite challenging, but it has been completely worth it. It has been the way that our agency has gone from A to Z in terms of growth because of our work with our coalition. So for those of you who are working at small, grassroots, community-based, culturally specific organizations, I encourage you to reach out to your coalitions and just start joining the meetings, learning more about how you all can work together. I did not realize that, I was really afraid of the subcontracts coming in. I was very new to the organization, and but it was the best decision that I made because we've been able to more than triple our housing assistance, not only through the grant itself, the HUD grant itself, but also through the way we were able to leverage that grant. And with that, that was my last slide, but I, of course, am open to any questions. Just like Sheena was saying, you guys can email me or contact me anytime if you want just some advice on how we do stuff. We're still a pretty small agency, but we say we're small but mighty, and we're really trying to do the best we can for survivors in culturally specific groups.
Thank you so much, Rachna and Sheena, for your excellent presentations and just sharing with everybody what is possible and demystifying the pieces around applying and partnering and being able to have access to these resources. I think it's so important that culturally specific organizations have HUD funding and have creative ways to ensure that they can partner if they don't want all the administrative pieces and all the headaches and hassles. So it's good to know that there's a lot of different options and different ways to look at rolling these funds out into different communities. And then just a little bit more, because I want to make sure there's time for questions. All the points have been highlighted many times, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to make sure that people know that the HUD NOFA is coming out supposedly early May if everything's on schedule. So what we know is there's going to be an additional $50 million in that HUD NOFA, and that's going to be for an additional DV set aside. So there's still opportunity for people to apply and to have access to those new resources, and we anticipate it'll be for rapid rehousing or the joint component project, which is transitional housing, rapid rehousing hybrid, and then also for coordinated entry. So when you heard what Sheena and Rachna were describing in terms of like all the coordination pieces and the different roles that people play, that there's a need obviously for the money and for people to roll out the housing resources, but it's also critical that there's money to do coordination and policy development and have the ability and time to be at the table, because as we know, when you're working in nonprofits and trying to do all the things, like you don't always have the time to go to all the meetings or do all the policy development. So that there's also a particular set aside of money in that pot that is for coordination and coordinated entry. So that's really exciting. It's just important to note that as a result of the SPARK report and a lot of the data and what people are learning at the federal level, HUD did include a priority to include marginalized communities in planning efforts to prevent and homelessness. And so specifically for culturally specific organizations, when you're working with your continuums of care or your collaborative applicants that are applying for the HUD NOFA funds, this is something that's very important and that HUD, the NOFA process is scoring on. So the continuums of care need you at the table and need your voices, and just as many as culturally specific agencies that can apply and access these resources, the better. As we can hear from the stories that describe that it looks different when you're working with survivors who are not only trying to flee from domestic violence, from intimate partner violence, but also have community challenges or familial challenges or familial abuse that's also happening. There's lots of layers where they would need the wraparound services and the culturally specific services that you all provide. So without further ado, I think I'm just going to open it up for questions, and we have a few more minutes and then we can wrap it up, and then everyone on this webinar is available for TA and consultation, and we're available when the HUD NOFA comes out. So we're definitely here for you when you're thinking through what you want to do with these new resources and thinking about the housing work in your community. So I'm going to open it up for a few minutes, and I don't see any questions in the chat box. So we'll give it a second to see if anybody else has any questions. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Oh, I see. I love it when this happens. Okay, April's typing, so let's see what the question is. Oh, no. Maybe not. Sorry, I called you out, April. Anyways, I think we're going to go ahead and wait a sec. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I don't see any questions coming in, and so this will bring us to the end of our webinar, and I want to thank you all for joining us and for some of the questions in the chat room. On behalf of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, I'd like to thank Sheena and Rachna for taking the time to share your expertise and all your wisdom with us today. And I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar. There's a PowerPoint file you can click on really quick on the screen currently if you're on the webinar, but we'll also be sending out information after the webinar that you can share with your colleagues, and you'll also be able to find the resources. They live on our Safe Housing Partnerships website, and you can also find additional resources there about the upcoming HUD NOFA process. We'll be doing a series of webinars as soon as the HUD NOFA is released. We'll start planning for those in May if everything is on schedule. And if you need anything, you can also access the Safe Housing Partnerships website for technical assistance, and then you can also contact our presenters directly at the contact information on the screen. And we thank you again for participating, and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.